everybody, and welcome to tonight's episode of the Promethean Secular Frontiers, The Crucible. As you all can tell, I am indeed not Sunny Shell. I am filling in for her tonight. I'm bummed she can't be here tonight, but I'm very honored to be taking her place as host tonight. And I have with me a very special co-host, Miss Scientist Mel. Hello, Mel.
Hi, Laura. Thanks for having me on again. This is awesome.
Hey. I am really excited to be having you on. I always love talking with Shelly and all the other guests that we have on, but I love co-hosting with you. And I think tonight especially, you are the perfect person to have in my corner. Yay. So for those of you that don't know Scientist Mel, she is our resident YouTube science educator. And she's got a laundry list of degrees. She has a BS in biology, a BS in chemistry, a Master of the Arts in Teaching for secondary science education, and she just recently got her master's in analytical chemistry. So, Mel, you've got me beat by a degree or two or four.
I just like to collect them at this point. I don't know why. I just got addicted once I started sciencing. I'm like, I need to do this more. Just keep it. That's my crack, man.
We'll never stop. Oh, no, just keep them coming. Keep them coming. So we have with us tonight 5 guests. So tonight's going to be lively. It's going to be busy. So let's just jump right into it to give us as much time to talk as possible. So I'm going to really briefly introduce all of our guests tonight. First, we have with us Aron Ra, who is a well-known secular activist. He's the director of American Atheists and the director of the Phylogeny Explorer Project, which is a really cool online tree of life. It's very detailed, and I love the work he's doing on it. He's also the author of the foundational Falsehoods of Creationism. And if you haven't read the book yet, just jump on YouTube and see his series, then get to the book. He has an entire series of videos on evolution, systematic classifications of life. He does all kinds of stuff in the realms of science and also some combating religious myths. We have also with us Steve Savage, who is an agricultural scientist. I almost tripped over that word. He was trained as a plant pathologist, so he is going to be our resident plant expert on tonight's show. We have with us Greg Laden, Dr. Greg Laden. He's a former professor who is now writing and advising activist groups and candidates on policy. So he's taught at Harvard as a professor of biological anthropology, and then he taught also at the University of Minnesota. And that's really cool and exciting for me because I got my degree in cultural anthropology. So I think that the two marry well together, and I'm really excited to have some conversations with him tonight. We also have Brad Hughes, who is an associate professor of astronomy at the Chaffey College. Did I say that right? Chaffey?
Yeah. All right, okay.
Chaffey. Awesome. Yeah. Feel free to correct me at any point. Just jump in and be like, no. At Chaffey College. Yeah, so he will be talking from an astronomer's perspective, but we will still stick to the subject of evolution, and I'm really excited to see what kind of stuff he has to say about it. And last, but definitely not least, we have Billie Guerrero, and I think I just butchered your last name, Billie.
It's Guerrero.
Guerrero. Okay, thank you. And you have a degree in anthropology as well, with a focus in paleontology. And she also has a master's degree in geology at Cal State of San Bernardino. So if there's one thing that we know tonight is we have a world of experience in the room tonight. And so this is very, very exciting to have all these experts here to talk about the subject of evolution. So I'm going to throw a question your guys' way. You all have your own separate sort of schools of thought and your expertise. So how do you know from your precise expertise or from your standpoint, how do you know that evolution is true? And I will let anyone just jump in and start answering that.
Well, define first what true means.
That is I like it right off the bat.
How about facts? How do you know that evolution is an actual thing that's a fact?
There you go.
How about
that?
Let's
see. We've been using it in agriculture or throughout agriculture, throughout our entire history. So we've known, forever that crossbreeding and other factors will produce, a diverse variance in any given lineage. And so it was only recently in the last couple hundred years that people started proposing explanations for why that is. So the fact was already there. It was how to explain the fact.
the mechanisms that we are missing.
I think a lot of people, particularly, this always got on my nerves. Well, it's just a theory, and that showed just a complete lack of understanding between why isn't it a law? So I've spent a lot of time trying to explain it's not CSI. Okay. Y'all are watching too many courtroom dramas. So
I'm embarrassed that my Board of Education in Texas said that we were activists were trying to take evolution from a theory and turn it into a law like gravity. And we were trying to reduce gravity to a theory. So they didn't understand atomic theory either.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh God. And that's like what a perfect explanation of what a theory is. It's an explanation as to why it is we see the things that we see happening. So it's based on laws.
I broke into a classroom in high school. I broke into this class that was teaching music theory. And I charged it in the middle of the class session. I yelled out that you can't teach music in school. It's only a theory. It's never been proven.
I'm sure that went over well. But that does show the ridiculousness of the conversation, does it not?
If I could jump in with the original question, with evidence, I guess, to kind of support the concept of evolution. It's definitely, because I have a paleontology background, I'm going to bring up fossils, right? So definitely going to talk a little bit about transitional fossils. And I think actually fossils are just a plus when it comes to, if we didn't have fossils, evolution would still be supported. So it's just kind of a plus. And for those that don't know, transitional fossils, if you think of the word transition, there's a, in between, and we could find fossilized remains of a life form, and that exhibits traits common to both an ancestral group and its derived group. So again, if anybody's listening that doesn't know what an ancestral group is like this genetic link from one's earliest ancestor, while a derived group is when a feature is found within a single group. So for example, if we have an ancestral trait in mammals, reptiles, fish, and birds, is that they all have a vertebral column. And if you look at the derived trait of, say, in animals like mammals, they have, you could say their derived trait is that they produce milk for their young, right? And one of my favorite transitional fossils that I talk about all the time is Tiktaalik rosé. So Tiktaalik is a good transitional fossil from fish to tetrapods or four-limbed animals. I have to show you my Tiktaalik tattoo, which is, let's see if I can get a good angle of that. It's like a derpy Tiktaalik. There you go.
That's an axolotl.
Yeah, it does. It's really cute. I love it. And it was found on Ellesmere Island, and it's a Devonian period age fossil that was during about 375 million years ago in the age of fishes. And it's showing a transition between, like I said, four-limbed animals and fish, or fish and four-limbed animals. And some of the characteristics that I like to point out is that one bone, two bones, lots of bones in your arms. So you have one large bone here in the upper arm, two bones in the lower part of your arm, lots of bones in the wrist, and then your digits. And the first time we see that in the fossil record is in Tiktaalik. So it's a great link between those two. And there's lots of other examples, but that's one of my favorites.
I realize I've already spoken on this, but as she mentioned a point about that if we didn't have fossils, my fascination is taxonomy, the Phylogeny Explorer Project, and taxonomy was the first evidence of evolution. And I still think it's the strongest, that it's so strong that even if we had never found fossil one, if the fossilization process didn't even happen, then taxonomy would still be enough to show that evolution happened.
Absolutely. And while we're on the subject of transitional species, I want you guys to put something to rest right now for the entire audience. The transitional species between our primate ancestors and humans. Like, that's the big thing that we hear all the time, right? Is, well, show me the transitional species. So let's go ahead and put that one to rest right now while we're on the subject. What do you guys think?
Australopithecus afarensis was not a hoax.
I don't know if anybody's ever seen that Futurama episode where you have the professor who's an orangutan talking to Professor Farnsworth. And they're talking about he denies transitional fossils. He starts popping up all these Australopithecus afarensis, africanus, and then they end up to a point where they don't have one, and then he's like, "Aha, I got you." So I actually show it in my class.
Like the gap is this big, but it's there.
Oh goodness.
The gap is so small that there really isn't much of a gap. I mean, you could maybe squeeze something else in there in the lineage that we already have, but it's pretty well complete. I mean, what we have already are forms that, if they were still alive now, they would almost certainly be chemically fertile. In paleoanthropology, and like the whole panel could probably agree with me on this, we squabble over the names of Heidelbergensis or Erectus or Bodoensis, but do they really always deserve their own names? Because we're talking about variants of variants, and at what point does it become speciation? We can't even be certain. It's fluid and continuous is what I'm trying to express.
Yeah. Species is almost maybe not a very good concept, because you can have, and I think plants, of course, I think plants would be the most dramatic example of that. There is a single species, which is essentially wild mustard. And from wild mustard, mostly long before we had any idea what we were doing in genetics, you got broccoli, you got cauliflower, you've got Brussels sprouts, you've got rapini, canola. These are all basically from one species, and yet, they don't look at all alike.
It's so interesting. That brings up a bit of a point on the biochemistry behind that. Me being a chemistry nerd, there's so much there in the DNA and the biochemical reactions that we have when you're talking about different species. Sometimes when you see one particular plant, it might make a particular chemical that would be poisonous to us.
Yes.
But a sister species, it's medicine. And you're talking about a slight change in just the chirality of the compound, or the fact that it's L or D on one particular functional group. A small, minute change like that, which comes from the DNA, just that slight, ever so slight change. We go from poison to medicine. It's so fascinating. So even if we didn't have fossils, we have taxonomy. We also have genetics, and we have these chemical compounds that we see across these species.
Well, take all the solanaceous plants, which would be your potatoes and peppers and all of those things that are highly related. Most of these things, and actually most your wild plants, make things to defend themselves. I always say plants can't run, so they made chemicals to ward off, and thorns and things like that. And so solanaceous plants made some really nasty glucosinolates, things like that, pretty nasty. So for instance, wild potatoes, you could kill yourself eating wild potatoes. You could make yourself seriously sick just by eating the green sprouts on a potato. If they sprout in your cabinet, don't eat the sprout part, because it has so much solanine in it. But then what's wonderful about modern genetics, and this has been done multiple times now, is that people have gone, potatoes are extremely hard to breed because they almost never make a seed. And they're vegetatively propagated. They're cloned. So you don't have really a mechanism of a very rapid, even human-driven evolution of the potato. But now people can go back to the Andes, get genes from wild potatoes, and put them into modern cultivars of potatoes. And now they're late blight resistant, the thing that almost killed Ireland in the 1800s. And so in my podcast about that on Pop Agriculture, by the way, I'll plug that. It says, should plants get to take a walk on the wild side? So
I like that. I'm glad you brought up potatoes, because I was going to bring up potatoes if nobody else did. So I'm glad you went there.
They're amazing, yes.
I do want to go back to really quickly to our original question, because I still want to hear from Bradley and Dr. Laden about, from their perspective, why evolution is a fact. So, Bradley, since you're our astronomer, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, we touched tangentially on evolution because, once in a while you hear students who they aren't sure and they're asking about it, especially when we do our Life in the Universe module, because they want to know whether or not it's likely that we could have life on other planets, and that would necessarily imply evolution is going to be happening on those planets. I don't know a lot about it because it's not my area of specialization, and so when students ask, I normally point them to, what was his first name? Is Richard? I can't remember. Lenski, Lenski, at University of Michigan State, who actually got bacteria to evolve by making them mutate, taking samples over and over and over and watching the mutated genome, and then eventually got them to the point where they were able to metabolize citrate, which used to be something that would kill the bacteria in the original sequence. So literally they evolved bacteria from one species of bacteria into another. And Lenski actually has like this long-running experiment that he published, I think in 2008, where it's like, here's exactly each intermediary step in the bacteria. So you can actually see the thing evolve into something that didn't used to be able to digest citrate and now can completely eat it. And so in doing so, I tell students, I said, I know that's not the same as me showing you bacteria becoming humans, but at least it opens the door to go, look, I can show clearly this is happening. Like, this is not hypothetical. It's not just in the past. We can do it in real time in labs if you want. And that at least provides a jumping off point to go, definitely things are evolving, definitely speciation is occurring. And that normally at least gets students to go, okay, I can see his point, because I can point right at it. I'll pull the article out and go, here you go, and that normally slows them down a lot if somebody's doubting it. That normally helps.
Yeah.
I really, really like that. Yeah, it really does confuse people when you talk about small, minute changes that happen over and over and over again. And so having just one change that you can see happen is a good way to kind of
then they
give an
come
example
up
that
with
you can wrap their mind.
Then they come up with the arbitrary distinction of that's just microevolution, right? And then when they talk about macroevolution, Bradley, what I always hear from people who don't want to understand this, I mean, it's not just that they don't understand it, it's because they deliberately don't want to understand this. But Bradley, what a lot of these people tell me is that evolution teaches that everything came from nothing, and that somehow evolution involves a big bang.
Yeah.
There are so many leaps in logic there that I can't even, I'm too old to make that many leaps. I can't do that. I'm too old for that.
I think when people say things like that, they don't realize that evolution at both of these levels relies on the same established mechanisms of evolutionary change. Mutation, migration, gene flow, genetic drift, all of those apply to micro and macro evolution. It's just that we need more time to see these macro changes. So we just need a whole lot of time.
I was just going to ask you another question, Bradley, but whenever.
Oh, sure. Sorry.
Okay. I know there's a lot of different ideas that are popping out about how it is that certain materials got to the Earth in order for these things to happen. Some think about maybe microorganisms that were on an asteroid and hit our planet. And, did that have something to do with engaging in making things like amino acids and that sort of thing? Do you have any input, or, do you talk about that much in your class? I'd really love to know what you think about that.
Oh, sure. I have plenty of input. Some people, there are scientists have hypothesized that there's this, cosmic origin. It came out of early asteroids. The problem is right now there's no real test to show for sure. The ALH 84001, which is a really long, wordy name for a meteorite that was found, I can't remember what year it was because I was in school at the time. So it's probably in the early to mid 90s. And
you're talking about the Murchison chondrite in 1969?
Yeah, and they thought it was maybe a life form. They said, no, wait, maybe that was something that came in after it already landed. And then so now I normally direct students to the Miller-Urey experiment, which produced what were thought to be early conditions in our on Earth at the time. And it's pretty much just putting these chemicals into a vat, letting them become a vapor, hitting them with sparks so they have an energy-driven source. And then doing so, when you pull out the trap at the bottom, you get amino acids in it. And very clearly and easily. And this is what leads to the idea of the primordial soup, that you would have had this stuff all over the earth, given that you have lots of lightning strikes and lots of these chemical precursors that would have been evident in the Earth's early geology. And so I go, okay, that's a really easy way to go. We can replicate at least up to amino acids in labs without even breaking a sweat. We can set one up in the chemistry lab right now if you feel like it. And so that at least gives us chemical precursors to go, okay, you got amino acids. Now, once you get to amino acids, we can get to proteins. And once you get to proteins, we've got all kinds of structures that can start showing up. Yeah, and so that's an easy way of going. Again, I can't get you from bacteria to human, but I can always show you that the pieces are all right there. And I see this a lot. I debated a guy you might have heard of once called Kent Hovind. You heard him, big creationist fella?
God, he still takes my calls, and I don't know why.
And I debated him at UCR. He came out when I was in grad school, and we had a debate, this whole thing. And it seemed to me that he was almost, not seems like, I think he was, being disingenuous. He would start trying to he'd go, oh, your expertise is this. Let me ask you a question about this other thing way over here. And I'm going, hold on, wait a minute. We just said that I'm not a pro in that. Neither are you. You're playing gotcha stuff, I said, if you want to stick to the areas I work in, we'll be just fine. Otherwise, I'm going to have to refer you to somebody who actually knows those things. I'm not the guy. But I felt there was a lot of disingenuity in there where he would say something and he would try to sneak around it. Well, you've never actually seen, you got amino acids, but you can't get amino acids to form cells. I'm like, well, wait a minute. How many questions do you want me to answer before you go, that's enough? Or are you just going to keep doing this on and on ad nauseum, And so, but I can at least go, okay, in a classroom, in a lab, I can point you toward, here are a lot of indicators that go, this is clearly reinforcing it in ways that I tell students, this is a big one. I'll tell students, notice how in some cases the theory runs ahead of the experiments. We had ideas in some cases about that we might have had life in the early Earth before Miller and Urey ever did the experiment that showed we could form amino acids. We had the idea of evolution in the 1800s before Watson and Crick figured out the molecular basis of it in the 1950s. So if it's not true,
Ross and Franklin, come on now, just a side note.
That's how I do it. Yeah.
I have a question for Greg.
No, that's perfect because we need to work him into the conversation as well, and I know that there's a lot of topics to cover.
He's been absorbing.
Since we started.
He's been absorbing. So, Greg, I have a question for you. Did you start your thesis with "Hello, my name is Greg Laden"? Because that's how Kent Hovind started his.
Is it? Actually, if you don't mind, I'd like to address the original question.
Sure.
Yes, please.
Which is, why do I think evolution is real? And I follow the Lewis Black school, which is when someone asks me, how do you know evolution is real? I show them a fossil. And if they don't get it, I throw it over their heads. If you haven't seen Lewis Black's routine on evolution, you should. But actually, that reminds me of a comment I had on something Aron said. You can believe in evolution based just on taxonomy, right? Mm-hmm. That's absolutely true. But it's also true that our species concept comes primarily from taxonomy. And that's actually where we get into trouble. Looking at paleo data, and I'm a paleoanthropologist, it's very hard to, it's relatively easy to define a species among animals in the living current world. Plants, I don't know about those. They're all kind of weird. But most animal species are real. Most animal species do not interbreed, do not interact. They do sometimes, and when they do, that's interesting. But they tend to be pretty different from each other enough, and they don't interbreed for all the different reasons that organisms don't interbreed. But as soon as you add time into that and look at the fossils, that concept, it isn't that the species don't work. It's just that your concept of species is synchronic, and it doesn't fit comfortably into a time deep sequence. So it's harder to manage that way. And on this question of what we know about human evolution, like how do we connect the apes to the modern, and the whole idea of transitional fossils and everything, I think all you guys said all the right stuff about it. I absolutely agree with everything you said. I do think we've lost something a few years ago with Darwini. What was the name of the species name? I can't remember, but the primate that was found, and Gingrich et al. Reported it as a missing link in primate evolution. And all of the
Darwinius Massillé.
Darwinius, yeah, and all of the science commenters and science writers got really mad because they used the word missing link. And we've now thrown out the word missing link. And I object to that because the missing link is a real concept. Darwin used the concept. He didn't exactly use that word, but he used that concept. And that is a concept of the species that you didn't know about before, but it answers a question you had about a transition. And it's not true that whenever you add something into that gap, you get 2 more gaps. You might have just simply answered the question. Mm-hmm. And there really aren't gaps there. But the reason why Gingrich used the term missing link is because, I know going off on a tangent here, but it was because they finally had a fossil that linked the dental evolution of early primates to the postcranial evolution of early primates, because they were independent sets of data that they could not put together without a skeleton. So it was a funny joke, a really funny joke, to call that species a missing link because it linked the head to the body. Anyway, and everyone didn't get it because they had used the word missing link just at the same time that science writers had decided if you used the word missing link, you were evil. Not noticing, by the way, that in Europe, Asia, and South Africa, paleoanthropologists routinely use the missing link, have always been so, and ignored this change in America. It's a standard term. By the way, in South Africa, the term where I've done a lot of my work, ape man, is also used. So maybe we have better terminology. Anyway, you had a question. No.
Oh, I did. It was the Kent Hovind one.
Oh yeah, okay, that's it, right? Yeah.
Oh, I know. He's had enough information about it. But I do have a question, particularly about human evolution, and it's kind of relevant a bit to the climate change that we're starting to experience. And this ties in a bit with astronomy as well as the fossil record and that sort of thing, and the evidence that we have to show the evolution of humans. About every 40,000 years or so, the axis of the Earth changes. The rotation changes a little bit to where it becomes more oval shaped, to where there's portions of the Earth that are closer to the sun than other portions. And what we've seen, at least according to Professor Brian Cox from the Human Universe, that's where I'm getting this from, but I'd really like to know your thoughts on this. We see an expansion of the cranium, almost double every 40,000 years within the fossil record. And they're trying to link a bit to that extreme climate change situation where parts of the Earth, the weather change, just that strange little shift in the orbit around the sun. See, I'm not an astronomer. Yeah. I'm a chemist.
So
I'm trying to explain that a bit.
The orbital question is that what happens is every so often, the longest day of the northern hemisphere occurs at the time that the Earth is at maximal distance from the sun. And in other words, the summers don't have as much solar energy as any other time during that period. And if other things are right, which might be at a global scale, the continents have to be in the right place, for example, you may get an ice age. And at some time during that period. And if you get an ice age, it may be sustained instead of just a startup ice age. I remember sitting in, as a very good question, I remember sitting in some kind of conference or meeting with David Pilbeam, and I think Lynn Isaac was there, and Richard Wrangham, and we were doing something about a graduate student procession or something, and Pilbeam just sort of blurted out, "We have to figure out how to get gorilla evolution to fit into Milankovitch cycles, or we're done." Which is a very interesting thing, because these cycles are tens of thousands of years, of periods of time that are tens of thousands of years long, in which there's a different climate. And how do you get a speciation event? And which of those events, as you go back in time, is hard to find. It's hard to match up the climate changes to the fossil record. It's really hard. So to get it at that level of detail is almost impossible. But what we do know, and I think others would agree with this, a lot of the most amazing evolutionary changes in animals have been when the context changes and something was going to go extinct, but instead gave rise to a new form because something really unique and special happened. And what happened 5 million years ago, plus or minus a 500,000 years, is the Earth changed a lot so that grasslands emerged. Now, usually this goes to the Serengeti model, which is something I do not subscribe to at all. But it does mean that there's a big change in the distribution of food resources, and this goes to plants. In a very well-watered tropical environment, there's very little going on under the ground. And in an arid, semi-arid, or even not that arid, but seasonal tropical environment, there's a lot of stuff going on under the ground. And of all of the mammals, only a very small number have ever even noticed it happening and adapted to using those underground resources. But those that have underwent major species radiations after that, including the suids, the ursids, and the hominins. And so that relates to those Milankovitch changes, because that is the very, very, very beginnings of anything that would begin to look like an ice age. And then really taking off about 2 million years ago with full-on regular ice ages happening. And so whatever you were doing as a forest ape, I think we put too much credit on bipedalism. These are chimp-like creatures walking around on 2 legs, being chimp-like creatures.
Right.
And then the shift occurred. We see that they don't have big teeth. They don't have a lot of the auspicine features yet. And then we see this shift to underground resources being available. And my view is that chimpanzee-like ancestors that were using leaves as their fallback food shifted to using roots as their fallback food, which really weren't available before. And when that happened, a lot of other things changed. And it unfortunately for some of them, put them into contact with a different range of predators, probably put them into contact with a different range of other resources they could use. The fruit in the drier environments were more seasonal, less available, and so on. And I think we see the mark of that in the Auspicine species, with their teeth being large and all kinds of other features of their skulls. So that's a long way of saying that the Milankovitch cycles are too fast and too short to link to the fossil record, but they must have been important. But they ultimately did lead to overall large-scale climate change, where it went from a tropical, subtropical regions covered with forest to that same region covered with different habitats.
So I think one important thing. Oh, go ahead, Aron.
I was just going to mention, when the original question of how we know evolution is true and versus the people that are arguing that it's not, and we mentioned the difference between micro and macro evolution. One interesting thing about the critics of evolution is that macroevolution, I've found every educational institution where I could find a definition of the two, says that macroevolution begins with speciation, that it's variation at or above the species level, including the evolution of new species. So speciation then is part of macroevolution. And the interesting thing is that creationists commonly now, where they didn't when I was a kid, everybody wanted to deny that speciation is possible until they realized that they can't make the Noah's Ark story work without it. And they can't admit that Lacaean pictus is different species than Canis lupus familiaris. I mean, there's dogs and African wild dogs, they have to be the same species even if they can't breed. So they have to come up with this kind of concept. So the evolution deniers fully accept now speciation, and then they try to say that that's not macro, but it is macro, and it's macro by definition, though they're never allowed to admit that. And the interesting thing is that they say that they accept microevolution, but they don't accept macroevolution. However, they don't accept mutation as a mechanism. They just insist that all of the potential variety of a species is already written into the gene code, that there can't be any new variation. They don't accept what has been well established and verified, that mutation is the source of new information in the genome. So literally, they don't accept microevolution. They're fully on board with macroevolution, but they don't accept micro.
If I could add to that really quickly, if I have enough energy to entertain those people and micro, macro, making those distinctions, I do like to bring up the case that in 1971, when biologists transplanted 10 Italian wall lizards from one island off the coast of Croatia to another island. So I just imagine like these Italian lizards being like, "Hey, you're moving me! Like, don't take me, But they're being moved, right? So they went back to check on them like 30 years later, and the immigrant lizards' descendants had undergone like some fundamental changes. The original lizards were actually insect eaters, mainly insect eaters. So they were placed on an island where there was an abundance of plants. So they had to, adapt to that. And their digestive systems had changed to accommodate that. They developed muscles between their large and small intestines that effectively created these fermenting chambers that allowed them to digest vegetation. And their heads became wider and longer to allow them to better bite and chew the grasses and leaves that they now had to eat. And this was only after 30 years. If you come back, 3 million years later, you probably won't have lizards anymore.
The whole idea of speciation, I think plants do mess with that a bit, and humans have messed with that a long time. So somewhere in the range of 10,000 years ago, early farmers, basically what they were doing is they were collecting seeds from the grasses around them that didn't drop all their seeds on the ground, and having absolutely no idea what they were doing, but just putting a selection pressure. They came up with what is a 3-species hybrid. It's got hexaploid. It doesn't just have 2 chromosomes like we do, and plants do this a lot, where they'll have 6, 8 chromosomes. Strawberries are an octoploid. Okay, so it's really messy when you try to talk about species. I think today, so wheat is what they ended up accidentally developing, which is got spelt and emmer and something else in there. And I think if you came out with that today and said, I've just come up with this wonderful new crop and you can make bread out of it and you can do all these things. And oh, by the way, we put together 3 species. What do you think the anti-GMO community would do with that?
Oh, gosh.
So you deal with creationists. My fight is usually with anti-GMO people. And the flip side of that is that for thousands of years, people have absolutely wanted to put the brakes on evolution. So would you take something like an apple or a grape or an olive? Probably olives and grapes would have been a bigger deal in our history. You don't grow those things from seeds, because if you do, you've got a cross and you don't get what you wanted. So if you ever find a grape or something like that you like, an olive, you graft that onto a rootstock and you clone the top part, because you don't want any more genetic change. Genetic change is your enemy if you're trying to crop that, except that then people figured out, and now much more intentionally, you can still do tons of genetic change on that rootstock and get pest resistance. You can, like apples today are dwarf apples. Well, that's because of DNA or RNA that comes up from the roots to the top and dwarfs the way that it grows. It changes the way the species on the top. And in fact, sometimes that's a different species of roots underneath the ground than the top. It's the true Frankenstein. And we've been doing that for thousands of years. 2 species put together.
It's
so while we're on the subject, oh no, go ahead. I was just going to say quickly, because we have a question in chat. While we're on the subject of species and speciation, Mannerite had put in a chat a little bit earlier. What's the best criteria to differentiate species? And then followed up with, can we make an argument based on genetic differences? So I would love to hear you guys weigh in on, because we've traditionally done it based on outward traits, right? So this kind of takes it to the next level. Would you guys like to discuss that a little bit?
Well, I'll jump in with a quick comment. I do actually, not to devalue your question, but it is one of those things that is less important than it sounds, because what differentiates species is what often happens is, I actually like to teach an evolution course without ever mentioning it once, because if you get into it, that's the rest of the course, and it's a very fascinating and important topic. But the simple version is species are populations that don't interbreed, and that immediately leads to all kinds of questions about what about lions and tigers, because they do in fact interbreed if they're left to, and in the past they certainly overlapped in their territory. They still do slightly. So does that mean they're all the same species? And the answer could be, well, you could define them as the same species if you want. You have striped lions and unstriped lions. But that's not practical because lions and tigers are behaviorally different and ecologically different enough that it's in other words, a lot of times their species distinctions are practical things, and the reasons why there's a difference or a barrier, there's a lot of different possible reasons why a barrier exists. There's many different ways species stay separate. So it becomes, and it ends up, when you get down into more and more detail, it's like the original question, why do I think evolution is true? Really, the real reason I think evolution is true and creationism isn't true, because when I hear an evolutionary story or look at an evolutionary problem, I become uncomfortable with our knowledge about something which fascinates me, and then we learn it and fill it in, and that is extraordinarily satisfying process. When I look at creationist stories, I go, what? And that's where it ends.
It's like the buck stops there.
Yeah. The buck stops there. This wasn't interesting to begin with, and you were lying. So just screw you. So that's how the species story goes. A little bit up to some point, the initial question actually ends up being trivial, unless you leave the range of pure science and genetics and go into philosophy. Then it becomes really interesting. But I'll leave it to others to answer the question from a genetic point of view, because I would like to hear other people's comments about where they think genetics
I think
gives
it's
a better idea. Yeah.
With what Dr. Laden was saying, particularly when you look at the tigers versus the lions, you also have, again, the behaviors when you're looking at what kind of ecological niche do they fill. So it's not just solely structures, reproduction, genetics, yes, does play a role in that, but also the ecological niche is really, really important, because as we saw with Billie earlier talking about transplanting lizards onto a different environment, they now have a different ecological niche that they fill. Their jobs have changed. And so hence they've kind of become a different species. So that's kind of a bit of my take on it. But I'd love to hear what everybody else has to say.
Yeah, I think with the biological definition of species, because this is a very muddy topic, but whether you could produce the viable offspring is another aspect to it. Whether these offspring are able to have kids of their own. So for like a liger, they're not going to be able to reproduce. And going back a little bit to Greg's point with creationism model and with evolution model, as science works, it's just that fact. It works. And with the creationist model, it's not viable. You cannot use it to find out about the natural world. And that's what makes definitely, when it comes, like when people ask me like, do you believe in evolution, or are you an evolutionist, which is I already know by that word where they're going, but it's doesn't matter whether I accept it or not. It happens. It's going to happen whether I don't. Well, with the creationist model, you're going to have to go a little bit above that. You're going to have to believe in it in order for it to work, because it's not something that could be applied to the natural world.
And just to throw in one more wild card here, I think a lot of evolution goes on including multiple species together in coevolution. The fact that we're understanding a lot more about the importance of our microbiome right now. There's a lot more cells in us that are microbes than there are cells. And it's not like they don't talk. It's not like there's never any genetic exchange between the two. You have horizontal gene transfer. Mutation is one thing, but you can have whole genes coming across. And within the plant world, you look at something like legumes. So you look at your soybeans, your beans, your all alfalfa, all those things. They basically provide a home and food for agrobacterium, not agrobacterium, sorry, for nitrogen fixing bacteria. And those two organisms, a bacteria and a plant, their evolution had to occur together. The selection pressures on them were on them as partners, and they had this wonderful thing. And then you add that to the community, because you look at something like tallgrass prairie. There's a bunch of legumes in it and a bunch of non-legumes in it, but they become a biome that sort of evolves together. And you could look at some things that some people would argue that humans have sort of evolved with the plants that we learned to grow. And once you had those plants, and you could, the societies that sort of developed original agriculture were able to kind of move around the world because they had this ability to grow their own food. The argument is even made that the plants basically were directing it, and the humans are their sort of slaves or caretakers. So
I like that take.
There's a whole division of research just on that. I worked for under a mentor, Dr. Dwayne McKenna, who I worked with on the Tree of Life project. And his core research was not only like mapping the genome of the ladybug, but also analyzing the relationships between beetles and certain plants and how they evolve together. I mean, it's out there. It's freaking amazing how a plant will become a certain way because a certain insect has been feeding on it, and how that insect changes because it's been feeding on this plant. It's fascinating.
And there really are no evolutionary stories that aren't co-evolutionary stories.
Yeah, I think you're right.
So I didn't want to throw something out there, but I want to give everybody a chance to answer that specific question before I put in my own 2 cents, because I am by far the least of all the experts on this panel. So did anybody else want to weigh in, or do you think we pretty much covered that topic pretty well?
Yeah,
we're good. Okay. The one thing that I wanted to throw out.
There's one last thing I could add.
Aaron, go for it. Yeah.
If people want to argue that, how can you prove that humans came from apes? It's the fact that we are still apes.
I love it.
Some more than others.
It is Planet of the Apes right now.
Right now, right here.
Right now.
The hairless apes. No, I love that. One thing I wanted to point out in terms of the argument about species and stuff is because I'm a huge language geek, and just to remember that the term species is descriptive, not prescriptive, right? And I say that a lot with different terms. Like, we are describing what we see. We're not putting things into boxes that can't be moved around, shifted, changed as our understanding changes. So when we say the term species, it best fits right now our ability to differentiate between things. Like different types of bird species that breed together or don't breed together. But that doesn't mean that it stops these species like the lion and tiger from creating a liger, right? It doesn't mean that there aren't species that are just right on the cusp of separating from each other to where they can still interbreed. So sometimes we need to hold terms like that sort of loosely in our understanding, so that we remember that these things are fluid and changing. But I did want to have you guys address some of the other questions in chat, because I've been catching a lot of them, and there's some really, really good ones. One from Mick Ghost Lovin. Did feathers become fur? And I don't know who wants to take that one, but that one I thought was interesting.
No, feathers did not become fur.
Easy answer to that question.
The interesting thing is that it almost started out as fur, because the earliest form of feathers is something like a down, but then there's an earlier form than that like pycnofibers. So what dinosaurs share in common with pterosaurs is a hair-like covering that is more likely protofeathers.
Yeah, feathers evolved separately in separate groups, and groups of animals. And feathers actually are a really cool topic in dinosaurs, especially, which is what I study. And they don't come about because of flight. They originally evolved because of possibly for warmth, right? Which leads to another question: is like, were dinosaurs warm-blooded? Were they in between, or were they cold-blooded? So yeah, it's an interesting topic. Could have a whole discussion about that in and of itself.
I love that. That's really fascinating. That actually brings me to a separate sort of line of questioning. When we talk about evolution and how do you guys know it's true and stuff, there's a lot of misinformation out there about evolution. And there's a lot of places where evolution kind of makes mistakes or doesn't do things the best way that it can. So I wanted to get your guys' take on the term survival of the fittest. And like, I find that term so problematic. And I wanted to have you guys address that for the audience. Evolution is not survival of the fittest, but in your guys' estimation, what is it?
Reproduction.
Well, it would be important to point out that Herbert Spencer is the one that came up with that. It's not a concept in science; it's a concept in economics, and it was also a class system structure where it was it was the rich people of the time being superior to the poor and working class is what that kind of was all about. Darwin said something vaguely similar in organisms being better adapted to their given environment at that moment, and he didn't agree with things like superiority or inferiority. He says these are determined by the environment entirely.
Yeah, Darwin talked about. He asked the question of what would happen if you had a continent of marsupial type mammals and a continent of placental type mammals, and you broke down the barrier. And he talked about how he felt the placental mammals were superior because of that environmental difference. They would sort of take over. But I think the key thing here is you have to use the term, if you want to use the term fitness, that's okay. So evolution in part is about fitness. And that's not survival necessarily. And fitness has to do with reproduction. So, yes. There's kind of two broad views of evolution, a neutral theory and the adaptive approach. And the dichotomy between the two is an utter falsehood, in my opinion. But differential fitness is an important concept in evolution. And so that's good. But that's, of course, too close to survival of the fittest to not be really careful with your terms. And you're right, it is a very annoying term.
I was just going to throw this in really quick. When I was teaching high school biology, a bunch of farm kids in the Bible Belt, I was talking about this earlier before we went live. I like to bring up the zombie apocalypse. So I would say,
I love this example.
I don't have to outrun the zombies. I just got to outrun you. And there's lots of different ways I can do that. And then if you perish, I get to pass on whatever genes made me better at this than you onto my children. And so whether it's Wile E. Coyote strategy or running faster, one of those two.
I have to throw something else in about that because it so irritates me that the people who are trying to denigrate evolution, especially in education, always want to say that death is the hero for evolution, which surprises me since Darwin's book was on the origin of and the preservation of species and the struggle for life, and it's ultimately a theory of biodiversity. So it is not the case that only the strong survive, and natural selection isn't responsible for most evolution. Most evolution is a product of genetic drift. It's just a product of genetic variance. So, I mean, biodiversity means one group becomes many. And so they diversify and become many different species. And that's the better way to look at it. I mean, some are not going to make it. Eventually, there will be some that are weeded out. But when one species becomes 2, and then 4, and then 8, and 16, 30, and so on, some of those will perish. Some of those won't make it. But you have how many different species of butterfly do we have? Just like right at the moment,
Right.
And are all of them? I mean, is it true that only the strong survive? Which one's the strongest damn butterfly?
I get what you're saying, Aron, and I really do appreciate that. Sometimes I find when I was teaching those kids, I would have to kind of meet them where they're at. And you can't really get a lot of those further in depth when you're just trying to get the kids to accept what it is that you're pick up what you're putting down. But yeah, no, I agree that it's much, much more than just the death option. But then it's kind of like, who's your audience?
I think your original question, Laura, though, is interesting because you talk about what evolution producing, I guess maybe you implied suboptimal results, or results that don't make sense as being great traits. And the one that humans are this point out for humans so often is our knees. That as we get older, our knees fail, and that's because
or the birth canal.
but actually, well, okay, that's it exactly. Our knees don't fail. We just get too old, and we're not hunter-gatherers constantly out there doing things. Hunter-gatherer knees don't fail. Okay, that's just like Westerners. The birth canal is the number one trait that fits this characteristic, and it is incredibly important. And when teaching, I think it's really, I like to point out to students that mammals generally do not have trouble with childbirth, with birth of their offspring. It doesn't happen in nature other than in humans and our domesticates. Okay, not that there's never a problem, but really there's the probability of high morbidity or mortality in human birth is incredibly high. It's so high, it is unbelievable that it would actually evolve.
I think it's number 53 last year, if you don't count COVID-19. It's somewhere in the 50s, number one of a killer.
It's more likely to kill you if you're a woman than a car crash. Okay, so why? And now, of course, we know the story is because we were bipedal and then we got big brains, and that didn't work out physiologically. But this ends up becoming incredibly important because it means we give birth to offspring that are very altricial compared to other primates. A baby chimpanzee can grab onto its mother and hold on and travel with her pretty much right away. Our infants are totally helpless and useless for many, many months. And then when they become toddlers, what do? When they become toddlers, they become basically dangerous to themselves to the extent that we're constantly trying to keep them from killing themselves.
Over-exuberant scientists that want to put everything in their mouth.
Now, these are traits that humans have that distinguish us from other apes. Okay, these are the key traits that distinguish us from other apes. The fact that we have childhood, during which time our enormously large brain learns all the stuff it's going to learn, that will make it eventually an adult brain. You keep learning
stuff. Isn't it 3 years old? By the time it's 3 years old, that's when it's ready for childhood, and then the brain doesn't fully develop till 25.
Yeah, well, there's about a 5 year. Our developmental range is about 5 years longer than it should be, and that period is somewhere after a couple of years up through sometime later. It kind of stretches in there somewhere, and that is the time when we learn when our brains become symbolic processing linguistic organs, and that's what makes us human. And so it's a trait that gives us the most trouble of all of our traits. The most costly trait we have exists in order for us to be linguistic symbolic humans.
You know, if God was real, I have lots of angry things to say about my anxiety. I'm just saying.
I have questions.
I have so many naughty words to say to God about my crippling anxiety. Thank you for the imposter syndrome, God. I really appreciate that.
Well, this will bring us up to the end of our show. So if anyone has a really quick, I know, Steve, you were just about to talk and I hate to cut you off. So if you want to go ahead and close out really quick, and then I'll end this show, but we are coming right up to the end.
Well, I just say, one question that might come up is, we're probably not going to evolve our way out of a problem like climate change. Our reproductive rate is really slow. We don't have mechanisms for that. A lot of organisms might, within the plant world, we talk about high R and high K plants. There's plants that evolve very slowly. A lot of them vegetatively reproduce, almost never make seeds. And then you've got other species that go crazy with the seeds, and maybe 1 in 100,000 of those seeds actually ever grows and becomes a plant. We have a little bit higher standard for what survival rate we want from our offspring. But right now, with climate change and other pressures, human pressures going on in the farming community, there's a plant called the Palmer amaranth, this pigweed. And each plant makes 500,000 seeds. And this plant is adapting really fast to a changing world. We don't have that option, unfortunately.
Yeah, people ask me about my hope for the future regarding climate change. And I tell them, well, I'm just glad that I'm old and can afford the good drinks.
I like it. Good answer.
I pretty much try to push the same thing. I'm like, if you don't take this seriously, it's going to be extremely expensive for you to feed your family and afford water and air conditioning and all these things that you love so much that science gives you is going to be ridiculously expensive. So it's almost like when you're communicating with the public, you got to speak to them in a way to where it's going to be real to them. Because they don't former high school teacher, the critical thinking's not there. It's just not there. So you're like, do you want to pay $300 a month for your electrical bill? Because that's your future. Take this seriously.
And a lot of what I do these days is actually communicating about climate science and energy transition. And I can tell you that all of our messaging, the best possible messaging we can apply, will never be as good as one really kick-ass hurricane.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or 100 or so tornadoes in December.
Right.
Oh my God.
Those are our messages right now, and they're working a little bit.
I'm tired of sleeping in my bathroom, guys. I really am.
I'm in the basement now.
But we can still tap into evolution sometimes to help with this. I just read a thing today. There is a certain kind of algae, seaweed, that grows off the coast of Australia, and if you feed it to cows, they won't make methane in their burps, which is from bacteria that are not helping that cow. The cow does not need that.
Wow.
And so, there was never any way that seaweed from Australia was going to end up in cows in Iowa, but we can't evolve, but we can tap into the amazing genetic diversity that has evolved out there and use it.
That's a fascinating idea.
Yeah, I just want to thank you for bringing it back around to the positive as we end this show, because we were going to end on a low note and you brought it back around, and that's perfect. So I'm calling it here. I do want to take a quick second to thank our producers. We have Josh, Kat, Wes, Phil, and Jenna. Thank you guys for doing what you do in the background, because without all the background stuff, there's no video stuff. So without you, there's no us. I also really want to thank our patrons. We have Phil, Sunny, and Jenna are our patrons. If you guys would like to be a patron, go check out the patron page. I know that the support would be very, very much appreciated to keep this this ball rolling. So thank you guys for that. And thank you, all the guests that we had on today. We had quite a panel, but everybody spoke up. We got some really, really good information. And I was thrilled to be able to host you guys and be on tonight with each one of you and hear all the different unique perspectives. So thank you guys for taking the time out of your busy schedules to come and be here with us. On that note, we're going to end it. So thank you, viewers, for watching, and we'll catch you all next time.
Bye.
Bye.